Yesterday morning in Washington, a slate of 7 crypto tax bills landed in front of the House Ways and Means Committee. The committee held a hearing on them, talked for several hours, and went home. Nothing was passed. No vote was taken. By the usual rhythm of the news cycle, that sounds like very little. And in one way, it was. Hearing was just a hearing. But the room those 7 bills are now sitting in is the most powerful tax writing committee in the U.S. House, and that committee hadn't sat down with a dedicated slate of bills on this subject in more than a decade. So if you slow down a little, what happened yesterday is one of the quieter, more durable kinds of news. The kind where a slow rulebook starts to move. The rulebook in question is the U.S. tax code. And the part of the code that matters today is the one that sits between a person who holds Bitcoin and the simple act of spending it. To see why that matters, it helps to back up and ask a basic definitional question. What does it actually mean for something to function as money? The textbook answer is a 3-legged stool. A unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. The leg that matters today is the third one, because medium of exchange is just the formal way of saying a thing you can spend without converting it first. That's the test. If you have to convert it into something else before you can pay for groceries, it isn't really functioning as money. It's a holding that you sometimes liquidate. Now hold that idea, and look at how the U.S. tax code treats 2 everyday things you might buy a cup of coffee with. The first is a $5 bill out of your wallet. You hand it over, you get the coffee. That's the end of the story. There's no taxable event because dollars are currency. The IRS treats them as currency. You don't owe anyone an accounting. The tax code looks the other way because it has to. If every spend of every dollar were a taxable event, the entire system would seize up overnight. The second thing is $5 worth of Bitcoin. And here the story is genuinely different. In March of 2014, the IRS issued what's called Notice 2014-21. It was an internal piece of guidance, not a law. The ruling was that Bitcoin would be treated as property, not as currency. And property has a very specific tax meaning. When you dispose of it, sell it, trade it, hand it over in exchange for something else, the IRS looks at the difference. The difference between what you paid for it and what it's worth at the moment. That difference is a realized gain or loss. So the moment you spend the Bitcoin on the coffee, the IRS's view is that you first sold the Bitcoin for its dollar value. You realized whatever gain or loss sits between that moment and your cost basis, and only then did you use the imaginary dollars to buy the coffee. 2 transactions, taxed separately, for $5 worth of coffee. And that's the friction barrier. That's the structural reason Bitcoin has not, in the 12 years since that ruling, become a real medium of exchange in the United States. It isn't a technology problem, mind you. Spending Bitcoin on a cup of coffee was solved a long time ago, first on-chain, and then on the Lightning Network for the small everyday amounts. The reason almost nobody actually does it is the tax code. Because nobody, when they really think about it, wants to keep a per-transaction ledger of cost basis and realized gains for every $5 spend. So in practice, almost no one does. The friction wins. The Bitcoin sits in cold storage. The dollars come out of the checking account, and Bitcoin functions as a long-term holding rather than as money. The tax code has, very quietly, decided that Bitcoin is allowed to be in everyday American life. Which brings us to the story yesterday. On June 9th, the House Ways and Means Committee convened a legislative discussion hearing on the slate. The committee is chaired by Republican Jason Smith of Missouri, and the slate of 7 draft bills had been circulated over the prior 4 days. A discussion hearing isn't a markup. It isn't a floor vote. No bill was passed. The path to actual law is still long. Committee markup, House floor vote, Senate passage, presidential signature. None of those steps has a confirmed date as of this morning. So everything that follows is, for now, proposal language. But proposal language at Ways and Means is the kind that sometimes turns into law, so it's worth understanding what's in the slate. The lead bill is called the Less Tax Paperwork for Digital Asset Owners Act. It addresses what's called the de minimis problem. The tax code already has de minimis carve-outs for things like personal foreign currency transactions. When you spend a few euros on a coffee in Paris, you don't come home and calculate the gain or loss against your original dollar to euro exchange. The carve-out exists because, again, otherwise, the system would seize up. The Less Tax Paperwork bill would extend a similar idea to crypto, but the House version is narrowly drawn. It exempts crypto network transaction fees, the gas fees, under $10, capped at 5,000 such transactions per year. It does not cover everyday consumer spending. Buying a cup of coffee with appreciated Bitcoin is still a reportable taxable event. The bill closes a small piece of the friction at a gas fee level. It does not close the friction at the consumer spending level. The Senate version is more permissive. Senator Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming has parallel language at $300 per transaction with a $5,000 annual cap. $300 is a meaningfully different threshold than $10. $300 is a real dinner check. It's a real rideshare. It's a real grocery run. If the Senate number became law, the friction barrier on small everyday spending would, in practice, mostly disappear. The House number, even if passed exactly as written, would not. So one of the things to watch is which of those two numbers ends up surviving the negotiation between the chambers. The slate also includes the Tax Clarity for Mining and Staking Act. It addresses a different layer of the same friction. Take a current IRS rule called Revenue Ruling 2023-14, issued just 3 years ago. It applies when someone earns new tokens for the work of running the network. That earning is treated as ordinary income on the day the tokens land in the wallet, which sounds reasonable on its face, until you remember a few things. The holder may never have actually sold those tokens, and the dollar value at receipt may have been far higher than the dollar value 6 months later when the tax bill comes due. So the holder owes ordinary income tax, in dollars, on a paper amount of Bitcoin that may not be worth nearly that much anymore. The House draft would defer the tax event from receipt to disposition, taxed when sold, not when earned. That removes a real liquidity pressure on the people who actually run the network. The slate also extends the wash sale rule from securities to crypto. The wash sale rule says that if you sell a stock at a loss and rebuy it within 30 days, you don't get to claim the loss. That rule doesn't apply to crypto today. The slate would close that gap. It cuts the other way from the de minimis fix, mind you, less favorable to active sellers, but more consistent across asset classes. So where does all this land on a Wednesday morning in June? Two things stand out. The first is the simpler one. The hearing yesterday was just a hearing. The ranking Democrat on the committee, Richard Neal of Massachusetts, called the mood healthy skepticism. That's a polite Washington way of saying the Democrats weren't in any rush to move these bills to the floor. So nothing about the hearing tells anyone when, or even if, any version becomes law. The right way to hold all this is patiently. The rulebook is moving. It is not today in final form. The second thing is the deeper one, though. It's the part you can spend years missing if you only watch price for clues. The tax code is one of the slowest, most durable rulebooks the holder of any asset operates under. Slower than ETF flows. Slower than any single Treasury announcement. Slower even than most securities regulation. Because it touches every single person who holds the asset on every single year they file. So a hearing that takes the per-transaction friction seriously is the kind of news that shifts the floor of what's possible 3 or 5 years from now. Even if no bill passes this year, And what someone is allowed to do with Bitcoin without selling it 3 or 5 years from now is the actual long horizon question. Yesterday's hearing is one of the small cracks in that floor. So there's a few questions worth answering directly. Wasn't this all already decided in 2014? Well, yes and no. The 2014 ruling, Notice 2014-21, was IRS guidance, not a statute, which means it can be overridden by an act of Congress. Statutes are higher authority than IRS guidance, and a tax code change at Ways and Means is actually the kind of statute. So the 2014 ruling was decisive at the time. It isn't a permanent decision. Yesterday's hearing is the legislative branch starting to reopen the question. If the House of Minimis is only $10 on gas fees, why does it matter for a regular holder? It's a good question, but it's because the $10 number is a starting position, not a finishing position. Bills usually leave committee with very different numbers. The negotiation between the House $10 cap and the Senate $300 cap is what determines the actual impact. Reading this hearing as the start of that negotiation is more useful than reading the current House number as the final answer. Third, has anywhere else solved this? Different countries have made different choices. Germany treats Bitcoin held for more than a year as tax-free on disposal, which is a different way of solving the same friction. Portugal had a similar treatment for years and has since tightened it. The US is genuinely behind some of those countries on this question, which is part of why Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was at the Senate Finance Committee last week, urging passage of the Parallel Clarity Act. The competitiveness argument is real. Finally, does any of this affect what someone should be doing today? Nothing in this piece is tax advice, and please talk to a real tax professional about your specific situation. The right way to use this is as context for the rulebook itself, not as a trigger to change the position. The price action this morning, the ETF flows, the inflation print, those are short horizon. The rulebook story is long horizon. Both can be true at the same time. If you stuck with us through all of this, thanks for tuning in for this one. It's a longer piece than usual, but the rulebook material needs the room, so I appreciate you sticking with us. Yesterday on the channel, we talked about the first Fannie Mae-backed Bitcoin collateral mortgage closing in Ann Arbor. That piece and this one are really two halves of the same thing. They're both about the federal rulebook around what someone is allowed to do with Bitcoin without selling it. Yesterday was the collateral half. Today is the transaction tax half. If you missed yesterday's, give it a watch. It pairs naturally with this one. Hey guys, the price is the price today. The rulebook is what's quietly moving underneath it. All the best out there. Back to it.